Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone who's just joining us. Thank you for joining the webinar. Today, we're just going to wait, obviously, a couple of minutes for all the participants and attendees to join, and then we'll get started in 1 second. So, yeah, just give us 1 or 2 more minutes. We'll let everyone join, and then we'll get started. So for those of you who just joined, good afternoon. My name is Jack McGubbin, obviously Zero Waste Cities Program Coordinator. We are just waiting for a few more people to join us and then we'll get started. But for those already with us, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, your name, organization, and where you're joining us from today. And then, yeah, we'll get started in 1 or 2 more minutes just when everyone has joined. So bear with us 1 second, but yeah, feel free to say hi in the chat box in the meantime. All right, let's get going with this because we have a packed agenda and 90 minutes, so it's going to be quite tight, but lots of exciting topics and content to discuss. So first and foremost, hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Jack McQuibben, the Zero Waste Cities Program Coordinator at Zero Waste Europe, and thank you so much for joining our the latest in our ongoing series of webinars, Zero Waste Live webinars. This one today is going to look at climate change and what does zero waste have to do with the COP26, which, for those who aren't aware, is a major sort of conference of parties, member states, and range of delegates gathering in Glasgow at the moment to discuss the latest around climate change, key targets, goals, and how we're going to achieve those. We are at Zero Waste Europe. We're a Brussels-based NGO working on advocacy at the EU level, obviously being based in Brussels, but a key part of this as well is that we work from the bottom up via the Zero Waste Cities program. And so this is Zero Waste Europe's dedicated program to help cities and communities transition towards local zero waste strategies. And this is done by Zero Waste Europe members of, we have 31 members in 27 countries now across Europe. And of course, with the creation with our partners, the Mission Zero Academy, of the brand new Zero Waste City certification. And so, yes, today's session, we are, as I mentioned, going to look at what zero waste has to do with climate change and COP26. We're all familiar, hopefully, with how the climate crisis is continuing to deepening. And so this year's COP26 conference comes at a really critically important time. For delegates actually attending in Glasgow and for those of us watching, events unfold from afar, solutions to climate change not only need to be recognized first and foremost, but there really needs to be a strong enabling framework to be established, and therefore with the right financial, legal incentives for these solutions to be scaled up. We, of course, are going to look at the role of zero waste solutions can play in tackling climate change. The Zero Waste Cities framework in Europe provides a practical sort of toolbox and solutions for taking action on zero waste, but we're going to look at what this can have, what positive impact this can have on tackling climate change as well. So we'll be discussing, what the science says about zero waste solutions, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what role can zero waste cities play in helping achieve this net zero carbon world, and how are European cities already taking action to tackle climate change. And we have a really exciting panel with us today. So we have Dominic Hogg from Equinamato, pronouncing it horribly, apologies, Dominic, Catherine Zeller from C40, Celina from the City of Kiel, and David Christensen from the Danish waste management company called Boffa in Bjørnholm in Denmark. So today's webinar, we have 90 minutes. Each speaker will present about 8 to 9 minutes, and then there'll be a direct Q&A with that speaker. You can submit your questions throughout using the Q&A box below your screen, as well as introducing yourself in the chat. I will sort of relay the questions to each speaker, and then after each speaker has presented with the questions, we'll have a general Q&A with all speakers at the end. We're also streaming today's session on YouTube. For those of you joining by the YouTube channel, you can also submit your questions via the chat box there, and via the magic of technology, they'll work their way back to me somehow. But before I sort of introduce our first speaker, I wanted to just introduce a quick poll to sort of get people's thoughts, those of you attending the session. So hopefully we can sort of launch our first question. Here we go. What approximate percentage of global sort of CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, do you think comes from the urban environment, from cities? Ranging from 90% to 30%. And maybe we will have 10 seconds to answer this. It's there's no prizes or penalties, I'm afraid. It's just a general sense to set the scene for today's webinar. So maybe we should close the poll in 2 or 3 seconds if everyone's had a chance to vote. And then we can share the results perhaps. Voila. Yes. Perfect. So 64% of people guessed it correctly. According to the latest statistics, 70% approximately of CO2 emissions come from cities themselves. So this is a huge issue to tackle, but of course it's a huge area for positive action. So that's enough from me. Dominic Hogg is our first speaker, and Dominic is the director at Equinamoto. Dominic has vast sort of over 20 years experience in environmental policy, and the majority of this comes in sort of strategic policy areas related to waste and resource management, circular economy and resource efficiency. Dominic, I'll let you introduce yourself properly. We're very lucky and privileged to join us today, so thank you very much. And I will hand the virtual floor to you.
Many thanks, Jack, and welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And obviously very exciting times given everything that's going on at COP26. So I'm going to start today by giving something of a sort of global view. It's very waste focused. So this is not considering things that we might do, if you like, prior to stuff becoming waste prevention, reuse. And I'm not, I'm not going to go into that today, but that's not to say that's not of major concern, and I'll explain why as we go. But my background is very much in terms of resources, developing policies to respond to issues like the climate change effect of resource consumption and management. I've been closely involved over the last decade or so in lots of work at the European level on developing the waste management legislation at a company I used to work with called Eunomia. I'm now working at a company just with myself and my wife called Equanimator. So, but this is just to set some sort of global scene, if you like. The first thing that's important when we're discussing resources waste management is this, and it's telling us that of all global climate change emissions reckoned to be around 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year, about half of these come from producing materials and food. And so that's a really significant issue, because of course we're often focused on how we're going to generate the electricity and the heat that we use in our homes. But so much of the global climate change emissions is embodied in the things that we consume. And of course, when we consume them, we've become perhaps too used to throwing them away quite quickly. And according to the World Bank in 2016, there were about 2 billion tons of municipal waste generated every year. That's just the municipal waste. And the municipal waste is not universally well defined. The definitions vary hugely across countries. But there's all sorts of other waste coming from industry as well. But if we look just at that municipal waste and the embodied CO2 emissions associated with what it took to make that stuff that we throw away every year, it comes in at about 7 billion tons of CO2, just over. And we waste that every year in what we throw away. It's staggering. So clearly, going back to my initial point, if we generate less of this waste, then we're going to be reducing emissions associated with what it took to make that stuff. So what's quite interesting is when you look at the global picture and all the figures being reported by all the signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and you look at how much, what emissions are associated with waste management, you get a figure that looks a little like this: 1.6 billion tons. And it's often said, well, you know, waste management's not that important in the scheme of things. It's only 3% of global emissions. And by the way, this 1.6 billion tons also includes emissions from managing wastewaters. So it's all the sort of sewage management as well. But the problem here is that the waste sector emissions, as they're reported to the UN, includes only the emissions from open dumps, open burning, from landfills, from composting, anaerobic digestion, and incineration where there is no energy generated from the incinerator. If you generate energy from an incineration plant, your emissions are reported under in part of the inventory that deals with stationary combustion and power stations. So in the EU, for example, we've seen this nice decline in the emissions associated with what we're throwing away into landfills. But at the same time, what's not reported under the waste chapter is that we've seen the emissions going rocketing up from incineration. And so that doesn't get reported under the waste chapter when it's reported to the United Nations. And similarly, the benefits that we might get from recycling, they don't appear under the waste chapter. They appear in associated with the industries that are involved in producing plastic, steel, aluminium. And so they're also under the stationary combustion sector, under the industrial chapter. And so we don't see the benefits either. And so we've got a reporting system to the UN that's rather opaque in showing us this. Anyway, what could we achieve? We look forward to 2030, then we look at what we could do if we were managing waste better. And basically, there are three big hits that we can make progress on. One of them comes from, if we move from here over to here, then what we've done is we've eliminated all these emissions coming from open dumps and landfilling. And we're actually massively increasing the benefits associated with recycling. Benefits are the sort of negative numbers, how much we're avoiding from not producing primary materials. And the overall figure from eliminating open dumps and from essentially providing better recycling systems and also putting mixed waste sorting at the front of every landfill and incineration plant, we end up with something like 2.8 billion tons of CO2 saving. And that's with no radical new technology. That's with things that we know how to do today. Nothing, no moonshots here. That's what we do. That's what we get if we do everything well. So we basically more than wipe away the 3% supposedly of emissions that are reported under the waste chapter at the moment. Now, one of the big problems we have is that we one of the things that will happen as the energy systems decarbonize is, in theory, we get we will see the sort of benefits of not using energy in making things start to fall. But then if we look at the whole system picture here, what we want to do is start using less energy so we don't have to decarbonize all the energy we're using. So what's quite interesting, I made an estimate of how much electricity and heat we could save through that scenario I showed looking forward through better recycling of materials globally. And what we do is we wipe away 5% of electricity demand, 5% of heat demand. And that's recognized in the IEA scenarios around what we can do to reduce climate change emissions going forward. These behavioral changes and resource efficiency are basically part of the net zero pathway that even people like the IEA are now referring to. And what we do if we reduce the demand for electricity and heat, we speed up decarbonisation relative to where we would otherwise have to be. We don't have to build so much solar, wind projects. And we know that when we're doing that, all of those technologies have associated with them their own embodied emissions that we have to deal with. So, sorry about that. I realized I was obscuring some of the screen. This final point I think is really interesting because what this is trying to show, if you look at this top line, suppose I'm producing something, I've got a product which takes 5 tons to produce it from primary materials and 1 ton of CO2 to produce it from secondary materials. The global impact of that would be supposedly a benefit if I'm recycling the material and using secondary materials only, a saving of 4 tons of CO2 per ton of stuff that I recycle. But the way these inventories work, they're all about where the stuff is actually produced. So it's possible that you could be avoiding primary production that was produced overseas and actually increasing the use of secondary materials domestically, in which case your inventory actually gets worse. The amount of CO2 you report to the UN actually goes up. This is a real problem in my view, and it means that we're not capturing fully all the benefits of doing the good things in waste management, where we know we're reducing the global impact of what we're doing, but weirdly, we end up reporting something where our own domestic emissions get worse. And there's loads of co-benefits of doing the right thing here. Plastics collection is the key issue. Air quality from open burning, we can address that. Vector-borne diseases, we can address that. And finally, it's about habitats and livelihoods. And I deliberately put on the bottom right-hand side here that picture of wind turbines effectively in some parts of the world. These are, in some parts of the world, problematic in themselves is if people's livelihoods are compromised by their coming into being. And and we should remember, as we're decarbonizing the overall economy, that the more energy we use, then the more we're going to have to use of these renewable technologies, and none of them come at zero environmental impact overall. So that's me done. I hope that was interesting in terms of presenting this. One last point, by the way. The figure of 2.7 billion tons I gave assumed that the climate change impact of 1 ton of methane was 34 times the impact of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Now, there's a lot of focus right now globally on methane emissions. And a lot of people are arguing that we should be moving away from the 100-year view that the UN has traditionally taken and more towards the 20-year view that would say that each of those tons of methane isn't 21, as the UN's still sort of assuming, times as bad as CO2, but actually it's more like 86. And what that would do is, of course, that would massively increase the benefits of eliminating the open dumps and the landfills that we're talking about there and reducing those methane emissions. And I think those accounting issues are going to become very, very relevant in the future. After all, what is net zero? Thank you very much.
Dominic, thank you very much. Brilliant presentation again, and what a question to end on. That's a real, that's the brain going, what is net zero? But if you have, for participants, questions, reminder, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. But in the meantime, whilst you wait, I'm going to use my moderator privilege here, and Dominic can ask a couple of questions, or at least one. And you mentioned at the start, I think so practically, you mentioned in your report about the benefits that mixed waste sorting can have in terms of increasing recycling. In that calculation, you made about 2.8 billion tons of sort of emissions, the benefits from, more recycling and this mixed waste sorting. But for municipalities and waste management companies, what does this practically look like? You said we're not talking about moon sort of shooting for new ideas or solutions. These are practical things. What could someone take away from today to sort of change or adopt within their practices locally that can really, improve the mixed waste sorting?
Well, I mean, sadly, of course, none of us are perfect, and we rarely get 100% accurate sorting of waste across the whole municipality. Maybe we can get there. So we get closer generally in smaller municipalities than big ones, because it's more difficult to have the communications. We've got more diverse populations. But so typically we've got stuff that didn't get accurately sorted that's left in the residual waste, as we call it, and that can be now sorted. Particularly plastics can be pretty well sorted at those facilities. That's especially relevant, for example, for incineration plants at the moment, because you have the fossil carbon in the plastics, which then potentially just gets burnt straight away in an incineration plant. So some of the Nordic situations are already starting to think, well, okay, how can we get out the fossil carbon from the waste stream to make sure it's not getting combusted in an incineration plant? And of course, you get the upside is that if you hot wash that material, you can actually get it recycled, as well as some metals and possibly some glass, and possibly even some of the paper and card. Where you're talking about landfills, then you can do the same thing in principle. Now, of course, if you do that, you've not done a lot with the food waste and the organic waste, which is what's going to create the methane emissions when it's landfilled. So what you can then do, having done the mixed waste sorting, is go through a biological stabilization process of the remaining waste to actually reduce its potential to generate methane once it's landfilled. And if you go a little further than that, you can design the landfill with active cover layers so that the slower rate of flux of methane that remains coming through the cover layer has a much higher chance of being oxidized as it passes through that active cover layer. So you're aiming for as close to zero methane solution as you can get. You're not generating energy, but that's not so important anymore if the energy system itself is decarbonizing strongly. So there are going to be different solutions in different places, but what we should be focused on as the energy system decarbonizes is looking at the direct emissions of CO2 from the processes themselves, and whether or not we can get some benefit out from capturing some of the value of the remaining materials.
Perfect. Yeah, fantastic. I think there are some reports as well that you've written as well, Dominic, that sort of capture this information and these practices, these solutions in much more detail as well. Final question, very quickly, Dominic, before we move on to our second speaker.
Sorry, I'll try and be quick.
No worries. You mentioned about the reporting systems. Obviously, it was more focused globally, the IPCC, but do you have any sort of, what can we do within the European Union, particularly to sort of better report the way we emissions from the waste sector?
Yeah, I think my own, I'm still sort of thinking about this, but I wonder whether we're going to have to start thinking separately about the way in which we seek to introduce policy instruments. So I can understand why, for example, when we want to decarbonize our industry, we might be looking at what is being produced within our borders. But I think in terms of our overall performance as a country, region, block, whatever, then I think we should start looking at some slightly different metrics. So, for example, if I want to talk about net zero and I want to make sure that the capacity of the natural systems and other forms of CO2 removal completely absorb the emissions I'm responsible for, should I actually use only the emissions that I produce in the country or the ones related to my consumption? And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think, because otherwise you end up with the net zero issue becoming, as it were, easier to address the more you offshore your production. And I think, there's been many calls over the years to switch the accounting system off production and more towards consumption. I think the other thing that will help at the EU level is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. In theory, if that works well, it means if I use a ton of recycled aluminium in the EU with a carbon intensity of, say, 0.5 ton of CO2 per ton of aluminium, then the competitive advantage I get relative to a producer of aluminium in China that might have a carbon intensity of 20 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminium, it's 19.5 times whatever the EU alliance price is. And it's been recently around 50 euros. So that would mean that you've got a price wedge between the use of primary and secondary material of 950 euros per ton. Tell me, who's going to use primary aluminium from China under that, in those circumstances, in preference to the secondary material you can get here? And won't that drive people to get more and more of that secondary material back? And I think that's a really powerful policy mechanism that if I'd had my own way, I think would have been using it more as a negotiating tool at COP26 to pull the Chinese, the Indian producers who are exporting stuff to us that we're consuming. We'd have been using that with much greater effect.
Fascinating. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Dominic, for the presentation and for the answers to the questions. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll bring Dominic back in at the end when we sort of have a general Q&A, but let's move on to our second speaker now. And so, yes, we have Catherine Zeller from C40. And Catherine is the Senior Manager for Waste to Resources at C40 Cities. She manages the organization's Waste to Resources network. And this role includes assisting cities in accelerating actions around a climate-safe future, focusing on the transition from waste management to resource management, and obviously encouraging policies to go up the waste hierarchy towards prevention, reduction, and then obviously recycling. So yeah, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. I hand it over to you and to share your screen for your presentation.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Jack, and great being with all of you here today. So I'm gonna start screen sharing. Does this appear in presentation mode? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm talking from C40 Cities, which is a climate organization. And I would like to highlight that we really talk about inclusive climate action a lot. So what you can see here are the different action areas that we are working in. One of which is waste management, and I'll of course come back to that in a second. Before I do so, just a few words on the context. So the first is this organization was founded in 2005 in the context of international cooperation, which is interesting when we look at what's happening at COP this week and how different organizations can play different roles in this setup. So there was an understanding mainly in the context of G20, which is why this organization has the name C40. So there was a bunch of cities that understood we need to sit at this big table Because of the 70% of emissions that Jack mentioned in the survey at the beginning, and a range of other facts too, one of them being that around 70% of of megacities are located at coastal areas. So you have a mix of big cities and cities in general, on the one hand being a bit of the villain, as a lot of decisions are made in city that have brought us to the situation that we are in right now. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of opportunity to help us change and move into a better direction for inclusive climate action. So just another sentence on how we work. So the idea is really to have cooperation between the cities that are members in the network. There is ideally co-creation happening where 2 or 3 cities would sit together and try to come up with new solutions that they can test in their cities, scale up and share their learnings with others. This happens in all of the areas that I had just shown, and of course also waste management. So we actually have 2 different networks in C40. I'll come back to that in a second. Before we go there, this is where I sometimes also share the waste hierarchy. You know that the waste hierarchy shows why it's better to focus upstream. This is also true for the emissions that can be saved. So the highest potential to cut emissions is really by not producing waste at all, of course, avoiding its generation, and then once there are no opportunities to avoid waste, look at different options for recycling and disposal of waste. So I decided to not show the waste hierarchy because I assumed that most of you have seen it a lot of times. So here are just a few numbers to really leave another impression why this topic is so important also in the context of COP. So we know that about 90% of stress on water and biodiversity loss is caused by the extraction of natural resources. And at the same time, about half of global emissions, or depending on the scope, is captured, and methodologies. Also 70% of the emissions are caused in cities. So this is really a huge impact on the world we live in, and also about the relations we have with each other. We also know that high-income countries have a much higher footprint of material consumption than low-income countries, which is about 13 times the footprints that we have here in Europe compared to other regions in the world. So this is why we really focus on inclusive climate action also in waste management, and try to come up with solutions that include population within cities that might have more difficulties to get to higher consumption levels, or make their decisions based on the availabilities that they have, but also in relation to other regions in the world and the impact that we are causing with our decisions here in Europe in those regions. So that said, we do work in 2 different networks in C40. So we have the Sustainable Waste Systems Network that focuses mainly on more basic questions of waste management, which would be proper landfilling, making sure that there's 100% collection of waste in the city. And we have the Waste to Resources Network that I'm managing, and you can see the member cities in the network on this map. We focus much more on a circular economy approach in the network, and really try to concentrate our attention upstream as much as possible, and discuss the avoidance of waste as much as possible, and really try to set ambitious action there. To get to the ambition, we have a declaration which is called DC40 Advancing Towards Zero Waste Declaration. This is a voluntary commitment that cities were able to sign up to in 2018. We have 20 cities as members of this declaration and working together to reduce waste by 15% by 2030, and also increase diversion from landfill and incineration by 50% until 2030. So in very practical terms, we are trying to focus on, from all of the different options that are out there in terms of different waste streams, in different topics that you can focus on. We try to go first for those that have the highest impact in a set of different areas. So for food waste, and Dominic has just mentioned the importance of methane emissions. This is for the methane impact, one of the focus areas that we are working with. And we know that there's an opportunity to cut global warming by 0.05% until 2030, which is really a huge opportunity. And if you look over to what's happening at COP today and probably tomorrow, we are all hoping for a big pledge to happen on the cut of emissions from methane. So the next one is single-use items and packaging. The 40% here refer to packaging and single-use items being in many cities about 40% of the waste in public areas. So you know that this is a huge issue for a range of reasons, to keep spaces safe, clean and healthy. And it's also a good opportunity to really work with communication and the population in your city, raise awareness and get people on board to think more about their consumption decisions. The last one that I would like to mention is construction and demolition waste, which in many cities makes up 50% of the entire waste stream. And it's also a really big issue looking ahead. We know that about 2.5 billion people are going to move to cities by 2050, and all of them are going to need a place to stay and houses. So not just from the situation that we are in today, but also in terms of when we think about what a sustainable, climate-safe future really means. This is a big issue and a conversation that we really need to have, which we try to direct a lot into deconstruction as well, and the reuse of material. And yeah, so Jack, can you let me know how many minutes I have left? I have a feeling I'm running over.
Let's say 2 minutes, if that's all right with you.
That's perfect. So this is just a quote from Debbie Raphael, who's the director of the Department of the Environment in San Francisco, to really encourage everybody to make bold targets, because this can really drive change, and specifically when it comes to waste reduction. So once you have a target set, you can work around that, you can set up your communication, and you can start to think about other measures that can be taken in your city, and try to think about the co-benefits that can be generated, different consumption patterns, ownership models, all of the things attached to this. So this is really to encourage to set bold and ambitious targets. 2 examples, and then I'll just leave some links that you can look at to get more detailed information. So one of the cities we're also working with is Vancouver, and it's really worth taking a look at their single-use item strategy, which has certainly been one of the most ambitious and holistic ones that we have seen. They have really started to, they have not looked at only one item, but really tried to understand what kind of single-use items are in the city, where the problems are, and how they can make a systemic change with a stakeholder inclusive approach where everybody could have a say and try to come up with solutions. And then for food waste, Hong Kong is a great example. They have looked at schools and tried to help their students to not only bring their food from home, but also buy the food in schools with different portion sizes, so you can make sure that food waste doesn't occur because of one size fits all solutions for all of the students. There's some flexibility included. They did investment in fridges and some infrastructure to set this up, and got some great examples that you can find on our website, which actually was newly launched today with C40.org. You can find a lot of more information about what we are doing at COP, and you can also go to the C40 Knowledge Hub for more city case examples and some inspiration about what you can do in your city too. Yeah, and I'll stop here.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Super interesting, and yeah, the scope, the sort of work that C40 does, the cities that are involved is really impressive. And there is, yeah, I would just first of all remind people to use the Q&A box for questions for our speakers. But we have one for you, Catherine, about the Advancing Towards Zero Waste Declaration pledge. So there are goals to reduce waste generation by 15% and diversion from landfill incineration, I think it was 70% by 2030. But how are you enforcing this pledge? Or you mentioned it's voluntary, but are there sort of key targets that cities agreed to set, or like what's the monitoring framework, I suppose, at least for the work that you do with cities who have signed this declaration?
Right. So first of all, it's a voluntary commitment. So there is no hard tool that we would have at hand to make this 100% enforceable. But we do, of course, have some wiggling space. And of course, those cities that have signed up need to take this seriously. So if there is an understanding that a city, for some reason, sometimes it's changes also in policies, like governments change for all of the reasons, can't follow the commitments made in the pledge, then there's just an opportunity to detach from the commitment, which has happened already. And we keep moving forward with those cities that decide to follow through with the commitment.
Great. And you mentioned Vancouver, Hong Kong, but you work with other huge cities who have signed the declaration. I think London, New York, LA, Los Angeles, San Francisco. So these are some of the biggest cities on the planet. But from your work and your engagement, what are the main challenges that you see preventing these cities from really having sort of implementing ambitious zero waste strategies?
We have, I think, a range of different challenges. One of them is if you want to look at it from a climate change perspective, then we have this 3% number that Dominic also mentioned before, which is a huge issue. So we know that attention is worth a lot of political capital. And if in some kind of government structure, it doesn't matter if this is a city or a nation state, you want to get the attention to work on climate change and also get the resources and the political capital, then you might lose out against other areas that, of course, have huge impact, like energy generation, for example. And we don't have the data yet to really make the case on a consumption based emissions perspective for waste management and material management from a bigger perspective. So I'd say missing data to really make that point is one of the challenges that we have. And I can also add that I'm not sure if this is wishful thinking, but I do think that in the next years, once issues around energy generation and public transport hopefully get to a better situation, then material management also gets a bit more of this attention. And we will need to look also at how we want to generate renewable energy, what this means for material use. There are big questions that will need to be addressed in the next years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that. And finally, Catherine, quick question for you. We'll move on to our next speaker. Within the C40's network and the Waste to Resources program in particular, how much knowledge do you think or awareness there is around organics collection management? Obviously, you mentioned food waste reduction there, but within this network, Milan and San Francisco, for example, and as the question raises are best practices, do you think the cities that you work with understand and are trying to improve the food waste and organics waste in general collection from households and businesses?
I do think that there is a kind of general consensus that this is something really important and that it's needed to have segregated collection of organics at this point, specifically in global north cities. And I think the discussion around methane emissions and its importance is going to help us to also have more conversation about that with global south cities. This hasn't been, I think, the first priority, but it's getting much more attention now, and I'm having a positive view on the conversation ahead. Just adding perhaps one sentence, I'm not sure if this is 100% true for the reduction of organics. So we do have a lot of know-how about how to organize segregated collection, right? And also treatment mainly for organic waste. But there is a huge lack of understanding about waste reduction for organics. And that's true also for global north cities and European cities. Lack of data, again, lots of stakeholder management needed, lots of awareness raising.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to end on. So thank you, Catherine, for the presentation, for the questions and your answers as well. Super interesting. And I think actually today there's been a new deal launched at COP, agreeing from 80 or 90 countries agreeing to slash methane emissions. So it's clearly politically a priority. Let's see, obviously, the devil's in the detail of such deals. All right, before we move on to our next speaker, Celina, we're actually going to pose another poll to the attendees to see if you're still here and awake. Voila, just like that. What are the importance of zero waste strategies? For those, we all agree that climate change is a huge issue, but the role of zero waste, how important do you see it? Very important. It should feature centrally within government's climate strategies, slightly or not important as well. And so, yeah, forgive the the typo and importance. That's my mistake. But if you have maybe 10 seconds to answer this, to get your interest and to get your feedback about the importance that you think within the wider sort of climate change discussion that zero waste, its role and its performance can play. So maybe we will, close the poll in sort of 2 or 3 seconds, show the results straight after. Good, that's reassuring. For a Zero Waste Europe live webinar, 92% of people think that zero waste strategies are very important within a broader climate goal. So that's great. Great to hear. And then let's move on to our third speaker, Celina Karl from the city of Kiel in northern Germany. And Celina is the Zero Waste Project Manager within the Environmental Protection Department. And Kiel is actually the country of Germany's sort of first zero waste city. And Celina works on implementation of the city's zero waste measures locally. And Celina studied political and economic science as a bachelor's degree and social sustainability as a master's degree. So during her studies, Celina has also worked for the German Sustainability Award and coordinated this with national entrepreneurs. So Celina, we're very grateful you could join us today. Thank you. And I hand the floor and the presentation over for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. It's very nice to be here. I will quickly share my screen for you. So I hope you see my presentation. Yeah, I'm Celina Karl. As Jack already mentioned, I'm a project member of Zero Waste in the Environmental Protection Department in Kiel, and I'm very happy to speak today and to give you some insights in our Zero Waste strategy. Yeah, and I will quickly start with our journey. We started in September 2018, where the council decides that Kiel shall become a zero waste city. And Kiel is indeed the first city in Germany to get on its way to become a zero waste city. And the concept was finalized in August 2020. And then the council unanimously approved the concept in November 2020, which is a strong political backing, which we are very proud of. Our primary goals are to avoid and reduce the waste, and the secondary goal is also the certification by Zero Waste Europe. And we did finally reach the first milestone in May 2021 with the Zero Waste Europe. We did become the first zero waste candidate city in Germany and one of the first ones in Europe, which is very cool. And I quickly want to talk a little bit about our zero waste strategy. We have our 270 pages long-term strategy, which consists of 107 zero waste measures in 5 different sectors that basically cover the whole city. Those sectors are the waste system transformation, the educational institution, the public administration, industry, trade and events, and also the households. And we have objectives for every one of those sectors and also 2 main objectives. The 2 main objectives are shown here. We want to reduce the total amount of waste per capita per year in Kiel by an average of 50% by 2035, which is very equal to what Catherine said about those targets. And the second target is to halve the household and commercial waste, so-called residual waste, by 2035. And we want to reduce it to less than 50 kilogram per capita per year in the long term, which is quite ambitious, but also realistic, I think. And we are still at the beginning of our implementation phase. That's to mention. This is why most of our measures are not implemented yet. Yeah, now to the primary topic of our webinar today. How is climate protection linked to zero waste? Well, next to the protection of our resources, we want to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, especially CO2, through our zero waste approach in Kiel. And the use and consumption of resources generates greenhouse gas emissions on different levels along the value chain. You all know that, from exploitation, extraction of raw materials, processing, transportation, storage to disposal. On all those stages, so-called gray energy is produced, the energy which is used to produce any good or services. It is also referred to as embodied, indirect, or hidden energy. Even in case of recycling, a lot of gray energy is used to bring materials back into the circulation and to close the loop. That's why recycling is the 3rd step of our zero waste hierarchy, and prevention is the highest. So if we prevent to use packaging, for example, by buying local and unpacked, we avoid a lot of greenhouse gas in the first step. That's similar to other waste fractions. And we want to prevent and reduce those CO2 emissions through the avoidance of waste, because waste that is not generated does not waste any resources and does not consume energy. Therefore, one big focus of our zero waste project is that we want to change consumer and producer behavior. If we reduce and prevent waste, this means that resources can be saved along the whole value chain and greenhouse gas emissions are saved. But also the usage of secondary raw materials and the usage of renewable resources is important for climate protection, because this reduces the need for primary raw materials as well, and then avoids emissions along the value chain as well. The same accounts for separate collection of waste, which enhances recycling and thus reduces also the need for primary raw materials. And also the promoting of renewable resources also enhances innovations in materials and therefore lowers the need of primary resources. And furthermore, there are the local waste treatments, which reduces greenhouse emissions through transportation, for example, but also efficient energy recovery from residual waste also contributes to climate protection by replacing fossil fuels for energy generation. And for the Kiel Zero Waste strategy, and especially during the development of our measures, the focus was put on the top 3 levels of those waste hierarchy. And if we implement those measures, we can reduce the CO2 emissions which we generate in the whole waste sector. And here you can see the reduction of waste incineration and the thermal utilization by lowering the amount of waste that is being incinerated. The exact determination of saved resources is nevertheless very difficult. We can't evaluate what effects the consumer and production behavior in Kiel will have on production and processing of goods in other countries. That's why Kiel used the territorial principle to balance CO2 emissions. So we only looked at the waste in Kiel. If we implement all of our measures, we can nearly reduce 9,700 tons CO2 till 2035 and 13,500 tons CO2 till 2050. In addition, we can also reduce emissions through less transportation of waste. Those are nearly 800 tons CO2 till 2035 and nearly 500 tons CO2 till 2015. Those effects can, of course, be influenced by more transportation of separate collection, but also be lowered by electronic or alternative drive technology. And of course, those prevention of waste and emissions can be reduced worldwide as to reduction of emissions along the entire value chain. But those reductions cannot be evaluated in the city strategy, like I mentioned before. And also important, by showing the possible effects of the long-term strategy and zero waste scenarios, the Kiel inhabitants are being motivated to participate in the realization of the measures in practice. Those zero waste strategies are linked to the master plan 100% climate protection of Kiel, which is very important for the political backing. Yeah, now I want to quickly talk a little bit about the challenges. Well, we did mention before, we have those consumerism and the throwaway society. In those years right now, we need to change the consumer behavior and the production patterns in order to avoid those emissions generated by the waste management system and to achieve our zero waste goals on the communal level. And another challenge is, of course, the participation of key stakeholders to achieve effects in the waste reduction and to lower those emissions. A strong cooperative relation with companies, politics, society, and associations is important for implementation and the success of those strategies. This is particularly important since the city of Kiel does not have the power to force the industry and the trade sector to implement zero waste measures, but has to rely on voluntary commitment and the communication of our zero waste approaches and our zero waste goals. But, and the most important thing is that zero waste is an opportunity to reduce waste and to reduce those emissions and to protect resources through the prevention and the reduction of waste. Even if emissions from waste management is a relative small part in the whole city, we can reduce those emissions. And also the entire strategy is intended to create a sense of unity and connection within the Kiel Zero Waste project. In addition, the city of Kiel wants to take a role model for other cities. Thus, our zero waste approach and our waste management as such are one important part of Kiel city engagement in climate protection, mobility, and the implementation of sustainable development. Yeah, I'll say thank you for your attention, and I hope you have some interesting questions for me.
Thanks so much, Celina. Yeah, super interesting to hear the experiences of Kiel, and as you mentioned, it's one of the first zero waste candidate cities with our partners in Mission Zero Academy as well. And it's really sort of excitingly set a momentum, sort of building momentum, set a chain of events happening where other sort of German cities are now following suit. So it's yeah, commendable for the actions in Kiel. And yeah, a reminder, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A chat box. And we have one for Celina in terms of prioritizations for Kiel. 240 pages within the strategy. But what are the first zero waste measures that you have decided as a city to start implementing? Which ones did you prioritize first, and why? I suppose is interesting.
Yeah, with our council implementation in November 2020, we decided on 6 measures for the implementation. And those are to establish a zero waste advisory board for participating of those key stakeholders I already mentioned, of the associations or the society and the politics. We want to bring those together to talk about those processes and to evaluate the steps we are going through. But we are also tackling the zero waste schools. We want to raise the awareness of zero waste in those schools. We want to establish zero waste schools till 2035, which are nearly 10 we planned. We will see if we are going to reach them. But we also want to prove and audit a so-called pay-as-you-throw system, which is an waste management system which gives the residents the incentives by reducing waste in case of their waste are being collected and they are being weighting by the weight of the waste, and they need to pay for that. Yeah, and we have 1 or 2 more, and I will share them also with you afterwards.
Yeah, sounds great. And so the zero waste school stuff, maybe just to quickly expand on that, because I think it's interesting. It's identified as a key stakeholder for the city in terms of engaging community, or because they're sources of large volumes of waste for you guys.
Yeah, the schools are very important because those kids, they bring those knowledge into the households, and they are very important for our zero waste strategies, as they have those opportunities to educate the children on those resource protection and on the link to the climate protection within this zero waste topic, of course.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Celina. And maybe a final question from me. I think it's hugely interesting. So the Kiel has ambitious waste reduction targets for the future, 2030, 35. And of course, given it's a German city, it has very much restrictions on the volume it can landfill. So for you guys within the city, how are you managing this sort of transition between, as far as I am aware, the incinerator, the energy produced feeds local heating, the supplies local heating. Is that correct in Kiel? And
yes.
Therefore, like a broader conversation about how you, if waste is being sent for incineration is decreasing, how is this sort of being discussed within a broader sort of renewable or the energy sector as a whole, perhaps?
Yeah, of course, we want to move on with these topics. We want to reduce the waste which is being incinerated, but this is, and the graphic I showed you is under the permission that no waste is collected further from the surrounding areas in Kiel, which probably will be doing because the incineration is going to function efficiently. But we want to reduce it. That is a big challenge for us because this heating plant, this incineration plant is very efficient in Germany, and it is very efficient in Kiel for heating and for generating those energy. But of course, we want to decline those waste, which is going to these incineration plants. Yeah, of course, that's a challenge we need to tackle, and we need to move on within our discussions with the politics, of course.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Celina. For the sake of time, let's move on to David, our final speaker, last but not least. So David Christensen is the project manager at BOFA, BOFA, the waste management company under the regional municipality of Bjørnholm in Denmark. And the island of Bjørnholm has an ambitious vision of becoming a zero-waste society by 2032, so 11 years, when the company's waste incineration plant is set to shut down. But in Israel, David also sets up living labs with partners in Poland and Lithuania in order to try out innovative ways of separating, collecting and transporting waste in a co-design process with users, citizens, which is super exciting. And then as well as this, David is also a part-time lecturer at the Aalborg University for the BSc program in Urban, Energy and Environmental Planning in Copenhagen as well. So David, super glad you could join us today, and I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Jack. Very happy to be here and for this opportunity to address you all. Just a mic check and checking to see that the slides are being presented okay and that there's nothing covering. And I mean, I see the speakers on the sidebar, but they're not on yours. Like,
no, looks good.
Okay.
All yours.
Excellent. Well, yeah, that was a really good sort of thorough introduction to myself. So I'm sort of a hybrid kind of type of personnel at BOFA. I'm with a university, and I'm also with this unit. BOFA. When you look at waste management companies that I work for in Denmark, usually they are publicly owned utilities that are separate from the municipalities themselves. But BOFA, which I'm part of, is actually embedded as part of the regional municipality of Bornholm, where I'm from. And Bornholm, what is that? Bornholm is a part of Denmark, but it's an island in the Baltic Sea. So we started off with Dominic with his large-scale introduction to the climate challenges and the waste sector, and then we're going to the C40 network, going down then to Kiel, which is still a much bigger city than Bornholm is. And then we're here where we are. We're a small little island in the Baltic Sea, part of Denmark. Nonetheless, as you said, Jack, we have an ambitious strategy to achieve zero waste and close down incineration as a treatment option for all our waste by 2032. In case you haven't been to Bornholm, this is what some of it looks like. It's one of our more picturesque tourist cities called Gudhjem, where I've also done some of my project activities. We have approximately 40,000 or more, actually just under 40,000, 39,000 something inhabitants living on the island. But on top of that, we had a lot of we have a huge influx of tourists every year with over 500,000 visits per year. So we get a lot of seasonality with our waste generation and the amount of waste we have to treat. And BOFA, as mentioned before, is an embedded unit as part of the regional municipality of Bornholm, servicing the entire island. And it is the sole solid waste management authority and service provider. Usually, when you take a look at the way solid waste is managed in a Danish municipality, you have these publicly owned utilities, but and they have sort of they can receive household waste from the different catchment areas and the different municipalities that serve this waste treatment facility. But commercial waste is otherwise privatized. But in Bornholm, there are no really other actors. So we have a special dispensation as an island to be sort of a one-stop shop for all waste coming into us. And that's sort of an important, that shows the important role we have in being able to transition the waste system, because we are the one-stop shop for waste treatment on the island. We run the waste incineration plant. We also have a landfilling site. This is for very problematic waste fractions, sort of like asbestos and waste fractions from construction and demolition that have been contaminated by various chemicals and soot. So stuff that really cannot be recycled. As a last resort, we have a landfilling site. No other Danish island has that. We also have recycling centers where citizens and SMEs can travel in there. We have 6 sites and they can deposit their waste in all sorts of different fractions, which we then send for recycling. And then we have a waste processing center. It's a place where we have manual sorting of paper, cardboard, textiles, and we have a baling machine. We also receive certain plastic waste fraction from certain sectors of the commercial activities on Bornholm. We bale it and we set it for recycling as well. That's a sort of a special processing center that we have. And then we have a hazardous waste transfer site and receiving site and transfer site for biological waste and chemical waste on the island. So that's where we have physical infrastructure of this kind, but we're also the authority. We prepare waste plans, and we provide the legal framework for how waste is to be collected, and provide instructions for that on the island. What distinguishes ourselves compared to other municipalities in Denmark is the last bullet we have here. We have a vision of achieving zero waste by 2032! Exclamation point. No other municipality has actually gone out and gone that far, in Denmark at least. It's really great to see the city of Kiel and has been joining the framework that Zero Waste Europe has been setting up, where cities can sign up to be candidates for zero waste cities. Let's be honest, Jack, we've been talking about how Bornholm could be part of that as well. So that's something in progress we're talking with Zero Waste Europe about as well. But we've actually gone for saying that we want to achieve zero waste by 2032 for a very particular set of reasons that I'll get into in the next set of slides here. So this is it. This is a waste incineration plant. It's that is set to be decommissioned, and the reason why we've chosen 2032 as a target date for achieving zero waste is because this waste incineration plant is still being written off financially by 2032. It will have been economically written off, and it doesn't make sense to decommission a plant before it's been paid for, obviously. And as it currently stands, it's not entirely legal to do so. So that's the earliest cutoff date where we can say, well, we can actually go for zero waste, as we understand it. The way that we put it in this, and I'll put this graphic here. We've adopted a vision, and this is just like what City of Kiel was able to do. We've adopted a politically unanimously backed vision to achieve zero waste by 2032. It says there that in 2032, all waste in Bornholm is treated as resources. When we decommission this incineration plant by that time, what this vision lays forth is that all waste treatment that involves landfilling or incineration is to be completely shifted upwards in the waste hierarchy. Prevention, reuse, recycling, all of that has to be pushed up, and that's what we're working toward. And we don't have that much time, but if we don't set this high ambition level, we don't get the wheels going, so to speak. So I'm part of a team. I'm part of a unit here at BOFA, which is working hard towards attracting partners and carrying out innovative projects in order to help us reach this target of achieving zero waste. Just a couple of figures for you guys. We when I say that we're the one-stop shop for waste of all of Bornholm, a city of 39 or an island of 39,000, that amounts to something like 75,000 tons of waste per year. It's not a huge amount, but it's what we get here on Bornholm. When you look at the figures, when you take a look at what we did with the waste last year, 6.7% of that was sent for landfilling. 24.3 was incinerated, and 68.9 was sent for recycling. So we're not that far. I mean, we're looking at the 6-7% landfilling, and we're looking at the 24-something% incineration that needs to be shifted to the recycling. But at the same time, as part of the Circular Economy Action Plan and the revisions to the Waste Framework Directive that are sort of filtering down into how municipalities and waste system actors have to deal with this, the way that we do these statistics, the way we can say that we're sending something recycling, that's going to be changed as well, because we need to actually start reporting actual, factual, real recycling rates. So that's something up in the air. We don't have the entire measurement methods announced yet, but there's something in the data quality and the data measurement systems that will have a bearing on how we start monitoring this as we go forward with our vision. So that's just a point of attention for the way this is going to be developing going forward. How does this relate to climate? Well, it does so to a very high extent. What I'm putting up here in this slide is to say what I want to say here is the whole waste sector in Denmark was affected by a political agreement made among a vast majority of Danish political parties in the parliament last year, on June in 2020, where they announced a plan to have a green, climate neutral Danish waste sector by 2030. It says here the Danish government and a wide majority of the Danish parliament entered into this agreement, which entails a couple of things that has filtered down and also has a bearing on the way we work as municipalities in Denmark. Greenhouse gas emissions are set to be decreased by 0.7 million tons by 2030, and a lot of those greenhouse gas emissions, going back to actually what Dominic said as part of his presentation early on, is removing the fossil carbon that we have in the plastics, avoiding the combustion and incineration of that. So that is something that is filtering down to us. And when you combine it with our target of reducing incineration completely, well, that fits very nicely with Bornholm contributing somewhat significantly on our own local level towards this new political agreement and the targets set forth in that of achieving a climate neutral waste sector by 2030. It's in this government agreement. They set forth that 80% of plastic is to be taken out of commingled and residual waste streams sent for recycling. They want to achieve 60% real recycling rates of plastics, and they want to reduce waste incineration capacity all across the board in Denmark by 30% by 2030 to achieve this greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. All of that is a strong push, and it's just the Danish way of saying they want to do something about the climate challenge. Now, this is somewhat paradoxical because Denmark happens to be one of the most highest consuming per capita countries in the world and the highest waste generation countries in the world, with something like 800 kilos per capita per year, whereas the European generation rate is like something like 490, or just under 500 kilos per year. So we're a high consuming society, a high waste generating society, but at the same time, paradoxically, we have these high flying agreements that are sort of, luckily, and it's for the good of all, clamping down on the waste incineration lock-in investments we've been having for many decades now in Denmark, and making sure that there's more recycling going on, there's more sorting, there's a reduction of waste incineration capacity, and ultimately less greenhouse gas emissions related to the incineration. So we're doing it. I would say it's a step along the way. It's not radical, but at least we're really doing something clear and I would say somewhat ambitious on this front. One of the things, for example, and this is on the right part of this slide, is the government agreement has decided for the first time ever that Denmark has to start, and all the municipalities have to start streamlining their waste collection systems. That sounds pretty banal, but up to last year, different municipalities had different waste fractions that they collected at household level. It was very contextually specific, and that's being streamlined, being changed now. All municipalities have to sort in 10 predefined fractions, and that's something that we have to work with. At the same time, they want to achieve a bit flexibility for solutions, or allowing some commingled fractions, so it's not 10 fractions in 10 bins, but they want to allow some commingling. They want, as I mentioned earlier, they want to stimulate more recycling of plastic waste. That's with that 60% target. And they want more privatization. They want a strong recycling center where municipalities are forced to put more of their recycling of the collected waste. They want to put it into public procurement. So bidders. So they want to stimulate a market development for the downstream logistics that happens after waste collection companies like us start collecting waste and start figuring out what we want to do with the waste afterwards. So they're stimulating a market development there. And finally, they want to, like I said before, they want to reduce incineration capacity and reduce importation of waste, because we have these, as I mentioned previously, we've spent decades investing heavily in waste incineration technology in Denmark, and these are monsters that need to be fed. And in some cases, the residual waste or the waste streams that are generated at municipal level and household level in Denmark isn't enough to feed them. So we end up importing waste from abroad, and that's that's just been luckily it's been a hot topic political issue, and that's what they're trying to deal with here with this political agreement that was set forth last year, and is now we're seeing it being implemented all across the board in different ways, including with us in BOFA. What we heard initially as part of this webinar, a lot of the climate-related emissions when it comes to the waste sector has to do with taking out certain waste streams like plastics that are otherwise in residuals, and doing something with food waste, for example, because otherwise a lot of that from a global scale that gets landfilled, and there's methane emissions related to that. So that one of the things we can do at the municipal level is doing something about separate collection and proper treatment and recycling of what we can get once you start doing that. And this is what I'll go into just a little bit. What you see on the right hand part of the screen here is the existing collection system on Bornholm. It's very basic. We have a residual waste bin in a sack. That's it. And then we have a green bin to the side. We have paper, cardboard, and textiles in there. What we decided to do is one of the few things we can, or one of the innovative, but one of the few things we can do as a waste management company is just put a waste collection service into public tender using, and this is what we chose, an innovative public procurement method that was open, that we were able to use under EU public procurement law. It's not simply saying, as is otherwise is the what we see out there in municipal waste management companies, where we procure a very specific service with very specific technical specs. We've provided an open kind of public procurement for the waste collection of a number of fractions, and we've asked bidders to come up with their solution. So we had an innovative public procurement process here, which we've carried out. We've now awarded this tender to a company called HCS, who came to us with their best solution, that we for collecting these 12 waste fractions that I have here on this slide: cardboard, paper, food, beverage cartons, plastic, metal, glass, textiles, food waste, residual waste, hazardous waste, small size electronics and batteries. These are actually 12 waste fractions, so it's more than the 10 fractions that are mandated from governmental side in Denmark. But HCS has won this innovative public procurement through a number. It's a cumbersome process where a bunch of bidders came up with very different solutions, and we went into several rounds of negotiations with them to come up with their final bids. But we awarded it to HCS. We've given them a contract length of very long, 11 years to 3 months, which is far from the norm, which we see in the sector. And we've only given 50% weighting to price when evaluating the tender. 50% price and 50% quality. And as well, the final bullet says there, innovative partnerships as part of the contract. As part of the contract with HCS, we've so to speak bound them to devoting a number of hours to innovative activities with us on how to further develop waste collection and further develop sorting practices with citizens. So just to say, one of the big things we've done here is doing something about waste collection from a very basic to a very advanced, or more refined at least, waste collection system through public procurement as a tool. And now we're heading towards the next step now is to do a public tender or a public procurement for food waste treatment. Now, under EU public procurement law, you're not allowed to give geographic favor. You're not allowed to favor geographically service delivery providers that are close to you. It has to be an open market. So we can't say in our public procurement of food waste collection, it has to take place on Bornholm. So that's sort of an issue that we have to look into, but that would be the best way to ensure local nutrient circles and bio-waste treatment takes place on Bornholm. But there will be a tender for that coming up very soon, and then the next step would be to implement that, and hopefully after these two tenders, the collection tender and the food treatment tender, we've got a handle on some of the biggest and most climate challenging waste fractions. A couple of other things just want to get into. How are we on time, Jack?
I reckon you've got maybe about 45 seconds to a minute left, if that's okay.
then I try to really shorten it up. So we have other ways we can work with our zero waste vision. We have something called Zero Waste Bornholm. It's an innovation platform where we try to attract companies to work with us on innovative projects. And I'm skipping forward to our just an overview here of different partnership activities and project activities with partners we've managed to attract as part of that Zero Waste Bornholm platform. Everything from Nestlé and BASF, multinational companies here, to BLF, which is a local food and agricultural association, Espersen, which is a local fish producing company. This smiley logo belongs to a company called Frequent AI, which is a one-man company, but they're doing an AI based app solution for helping citizens with identifying waste, for helping them to sort their waste. And the next last logo there is Transform. They have a industrial composting prototype they want to test with us, and we have their prototype on our location, and the idea is to try industrial composting of various kinds of feedstocks. We have so just to say, we have an innovation platform. We're trying to attract companies here. We have everything from app development to bio waste treatment, to a lot of things that has to do with packaging and recycling of different kinds of plastics with the food producers and the agricultural producers on Bornholm. These are activities that are ongoing that we're working with on Bornholm. And you did mention that as part of your introduction, Jack, that we work with co-design with citizens. We have an EU project called Wasteman. The focus there was prototyping shared waste collection systems in the urban space. And what we did there was we tried out various forms of co-design methods. A very important aspect when dealing with zero waste is making sure you have the people on board with it. And so what we tried out there was very human, face-to-face methods and how to understand waste challenges at the local level and come up with solutions that we could test at a one-to-one scale. And that's what it looks like when we have one-to-one scale. We devised a prototype that was tested as part of the project in a couple of locations on Bornholm. This was a presentation for the Danish environmental minister, who you see there, the woman on the right-hand side. She was very happy with it, and we still have these prototypes, and we're using them for schools now as part of educational activities. After we tried out this shared waste collection sorting scheme in a couple of locations at Bornholm. And by the way, we'll be implementing full-scale, not mobile shared waste collection systems that we see here, but more the standard underground solution that we see in many places, but over 100 of them on Bornholm, because we see socioeconomically, it makes sense to implement those in very dense urban cores and medieval core centers, in urban spaces and urban towns where it's difficult to access with waste collection vehicles. And it also makes sense to implement them in summer cottage areas with one access road, just so you have one collection point for the summer houses over there. The Danish word for thank you is tak. That's what it says here on my final slide. And we have an innovation platform, Zero Waste Bornholm, as mentioned. Check it out, zerowastebornholm.com. And if anybody has an idea, who wants to work with us on Bornholm, we have a nice island test lab of 40,000 people we can test things on. Well, approach me.
David, thanks so much. Tak to you as well. And the link to the Zero Waste Bornholm initiative is in the chat as well for those who are interested. So thank you again. We have 2 minutes. Very quickly, David, a question for you. What caused this decision to sort of end the incineration? What was the political or social motivation behind it initially?
I would say there was a political window of opportunity, because at the time, this is very political, but you have to look at the composition of the municipal council. And at the time, there was a very prominent upsurge in Green parties and the number of mandates that they had in the municipal council. So there was political backing that was very opportune at the time. That was one aspect. The other thing is 2032 is a good time frame in the future, where you can say you don't have, I mean, it's the politicians themselves don't feel that much pressure to do it here and now. It's something for the next generation or the next generation of politicians to deal with once you get closer to the 2032 target. The third thing is economics. Like, we saw it coming from far away that the government would be closing down and incineration capacity. So rather than forced to jump off the cliff, why not be proactive here and try to be that a bit predictive there.
Absolutely. I think that's a key message. We always try to advocate for zero waste cities, rather than being forced to do something, do it by your own measures and at your own will. Thank you, David, so much. Super interesting presentation. Final question. We had arrived earlier from YouTube. For maybe I'm just going to fire this at your way, Dominic, if that's okay, about the correct solution for reducing methane from landfills in particular. It's a very hot topic. Obviously, it's a big problem to address, but in 1 minute, can you sort of summarize a response if possible?
I'll try. That might be worth taking it offline as well, but I suppose if you consider the stuff that's generating methane as degradable material, then what you want to do is degrade that material before you put it in the landfill in such a way as it's generating carbon dioxide and not methane. So you need an aerobic process. So you use something like, that looks a bit like a composting facility, but for your residual waste. There's lots of variation on that, but in principle, that's the idea. Try and rot down the organic material to generate CO2, not methane, then put it in a landfill, and then cover it with a lot of soil type stuff that's active with microorganisms that still oxidizes remaining methane as it goes through the surface.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We're unfortunately out of time, so we can't get too much into the quick Q&A. Yes, thank you to our excellent speakers, Dominic, Catherine, Celina, David. It's been a super interesting, relevant discussion, obviously perfectly timed for what's happening in Glasgow. And thank you everyone for joining and sort of participating in the webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. Final few things, go to the zerowasteCities.eu website for more information about our next webinars. The next one, the link is in the chat, about waste exports and the potential ban from the EU, as in December. And we have much more from January to June next year. As I mentioned, our partners at the Mission Zero Academy have developed a carbon calculator tool, so do go check that out. It's online. And yeah, we look forward to welcoming you, hopefully, to the next webinar soon. A massive, massive thank you to our speakers for giving up your time. Thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll speak soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Cheerio, everyone.
Bye.